Hello and welcome to First Chapter Friday. My name is Eva. I'm one of the librarians at the Alameda Free Library, and today I have a classic fiction story for you. It is so classic that I can remember reading it when I was in 4th or 5th grade, and it scared the pants off of me when I read it. It's still really popular and it's still kind of scary, and it's so popular that they made a movie out of it not that long ago. And the book that I'm talking about is The House with a Clock in Its Walls. And this is by John Bellairs. I am going to start reading this book to you. Normally I would start at the beginning of chapter 1, but it's a long chapter, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to where things start getting a little weird. One of the other really cool things about this book is that it is illustrated by Edward Gorey. He's a really famous illustrator, and you'll probably recognize his style as you read through the book, but this is his interpretation of The House with a Clock in Its Walls. All right, here I am, jumping ahead in chapter 1. Lewis has just gotten to town. He's arrived on a bus, and his Uncle Jonathan has met him. They've walked up to the house where Jonathan lives and where Lewis will now be living, and it's all lit up. It's a huge mansion, and they've come in through the door. Lewis walked down the long hall. It seemed to take forever. At the other end, he emerged into a room full of yellow light. There were pictures in heavy gilt frames on the walls. There was a mantelpiece covered with a wild assortment of junk. There was a big round table in the middle of the room, and over in the corner was a gray-haired woman in a baggy purple dress. She was standing with her ear to the wall, listening. And there she is. Lewis stopped and stared. He felt embarrassed. It was as if he had walked in on someone who was doing something he shouldn't be doing. He thought that he and Jonathan had made a good deal of noise coming in, but it was very apparent that the lady, whoever she was, had been surprised when he entered the room. Surprised and embarrassed like himself. Now she straightened up, smoothed her dress, and said cheerfully, "Hi there, I'm Mrs. Zimmerman. I live next door." Lewis found himself staring into one of the wrinkliest faces he had ever seen. But the eyes were friendly, and all the wrinkles were drawn up into smile lines. He shook hands. "This is Lewis, Florence," said Jonathan. "You remember Charlie writing about him. The bus was on time for a change. They must have gotten the driver drunk. Hey, have you been stealing any of my coins?" Jonathan walked over to the table. Now Lewis noticed that the red checkered tablecloth was covered with heaps and stacks of coins. All kinds of coins, most of them foreign. Donut-shaped Arabian coins with Boy Scout knots all over them. A heap of dark brown copper coins, all of which were stamped with the picture of a bald man who wore a handlebar mustache. There were big, heavy English pennies that showed Queen Victoria in various states of chinniness. And there were tiny silver coins no thicker than your fingernail. There was an egg-shaped Mexican silver dollar and a genuine Roman coin covered with green rust. But most of all, in shiny golden stacks, were brass coins with "Bon pour un franc" printed on them. Lewis liked the phrase, and since he didn't know any French, it got twisted around in his mind till it came out "Bon sour 1 franc." "No, I have not been stealing any of your precious brasher doubloons," said Mrs. Zimmerman in an irritated voice. "I was just straightening up the stacks, okay, brush mush?" "Straightening up the stacks. I've heard that one before, hag face. But it doesn't matter, because we're going to have to divvy up the coins 3 ways. You play poker, don't you, Lewis?" "Yes, but my dad won't." He stopped. Jonathan saw tears in his eyes. Lewis choked down a sob and went on. My dad wouldn't have let me play for money." "Oh, we don't play for money," said Mrs. Zimmerman, laughing. "If we did, this house and everything in it would belong to me." "Poop it would," said Jonathan, shuffling the cards and puffing clouds of smoke from his pipe. "Poop it would. Get 'em all divvied up, Frumpy? No? Well, when you're ready, it's going to be dealer's choice, and I'm the first dealer." No ladies' games like Spit Out the Window or Johnny's Nightshirt. Straight 5-card draw, nothing wild. He puffed some more and was about to deal the first hand when he stopped and looked at Mrs. Zimmerman with a mischievous smile. "Oh, by the way," he said, "you might bring Louis a glass of iced tea and get me a refill. No sugar. And bring out another plate of chocolate chip cookies." Mrs. Zimmerman stood up and clasped her hands subserviently in front of her. "How would you like your cookies, sir? Stuffed down your throat one by one, or crumbled up and sifted into your shirt collar?" Jonathan stuck out his tongue at her. "Ignore her, Louis. She thinks she's smart because she's got more college degrees than I have." "I would be smarter than you in any case, weird beard. Excuse me, folks, I'll be back in a minute." She turned and walked into the kitchen. Jonathan dealt a practice hand while she was gone. When Louis picked his cards up, he noticed that they were old and worn. Most of the corners were missing. But on each faded blue back was a rounded golden seal with an Aladdin's lamp in the middle. Above and below the seal were the words, "Capharnaum County Magicians Society." Mrs. Zimmerman returned with the cookies and iced tea, and the game began in earnest. Jonathan gathered up the cards and cut them together with a very professional zit. He shuffled and started to deal. Louis sipped his iced tea and felt very comfortable, very at home. They played until midnight, by which time Louis had red and black spots in front of his eyes. Pipe smoke hung in layers over the table and rose in a column from the shade of the floor lamp. It made the lamp seem magic, like the one on the playing cards. And there was something else magic about the game. Louis won. He won a lot. Usually he had rotten luck, but in this game he got straight flushes, royal flushes, 4 of a kind. Not all of the time, but enough to keep winning steadily. Maybe it was because Jonathan was such a lousy poker player. What Mrs. Zimmerman had said was certainly true. Whenever Jonathan had a good hand, he snortled and chortled and blew smoke out of both corners of his mouth. When he had a bad hand, he sulked and chewed his pipe stem impatiently. Mrs. Zimmerman was a crafty player who could bluff you under the table with a pair of deuces, but that night she just wasn't getting the cards. Maybe that's why Louis was winning. Maybe. But he had his doubts. For one thing, he could have sworn that once or twice, when he was reaching out to turn over a card that had been dealt to him, the card had changed. It had changed just like that while he was picking it up. This never happened when Louis was dealing, but it did happen when Jonathan or Mrs. Zimmerman was dealing. And more than once he had been about to throw in a hand when, after a second look, he discovered that the hand was a good one. It was odd. The mantel clock cleared its throat with a whir and started to chime midnight. Louis shot a quick glance at Uncle Jonathan, who was sitting there perfectly composed, puffing his pipe. Or was he composed? He seemed to be listening for something. The other clocks all over the house joined in. Louis sat entranced, listening to high-pitched dings, tinny wangs, melodious electric doorbell sounds, cuckoos from cuckoo clocks, and deep, sinister Chinese gongs roaring, "Bra-ra-ra-ra, bra-ra-ra-ra." These and many other clock sounds echoed through the house. Now and then, during this concert, Louis looked at Jonathan. Jonathan did not look back. He was staring at the wall, and his eyes had that glazed look again. Mrs. Zimmerman sat through the whole thing with her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. The last clock to strike was the grandfather clock in the study. It made a noise like a steamer trunk full of tin plates falling slowly and solemnly down a flight of stairs. When it stopped striking, Jonathan looked up. Yes, where were we? Well, Louis, it's midnight, isn't it? Game's over, time for bed." Jonathan cleared the table briskly. He gathered up the playing cards, stacked them, and put a rubber band around them. Snap! Then he reached under the table and came up with a red tin candy box with a picture of the new Zebedee County Courthouse on the lid. He scraped the clattering coins into the box, snapped the lid shut, pushed back his chair, wrapped out his pipe into a saucer, folded his hands in his lap. Well, and what do you think of 100 High Street, Louis? I think it's wonderful, Uncle Jonathan. I like the house and I like the town, and I like you two an awful lot. Louis wasn't lying. In spite of Jonathan's strange behavior and the eavesdropping habits of Mrs. Zimmerman, he had had a very good time during his first evening in New Zebedee. In fact, for most of the evening, he had had a great deal of trouble keeping himself from jumping up and down in his seat. He had been told that it was a bad thing to do in company. Jonathan took Louis's suitcase upstairs, and Louis got his first look at his new room. There was a tall black bed with battlements at the top of the headboard and footboard. In the corner was a black mirror that matched the bed, and near it was a black marble fireplace with a coffin-like black clock on its mantelpiece. Up against one wall was a tall glazed bookcase full of old books, and on top of the bookcase was a vase with cattails in it. In the middle of the floor was a large hooked rug. The pattern reminded Louis of a map of the United States, a map of the U.S. done by a crazy person. Many children might have been put off by the dark woodwork of the old room, but Louis loved it. He imagined that this was the sort of room Sherlock Holmes would have slept in. Louis got into his pajamas, put on his bathrobe and slippers, and shuffled down the hall to the bathroom. When he got back, he found that Jonathan had just finished building a fire in his fireplace. Jonathan got up and brushed twigs off of his vest. "Well, Louis, there you are. Need anything else?" "Gee, no, I guess not, Uncle Jonathan. This is a great room. I've always wanted a room with a fireplace in it." Jonathan smiled. He went over to the bedside table and turned on the reading lamp. "Read as long as you like tonight, Louis. Remember, school doesn't start for another 3 weeks. "I don't know if I'll read much after all the poker playing," said Louis, yawning. "But thanks anyway. Good night, Uncle Jonathan." "Good night, Louis." Jonathan started to close the door, but he stopped. "Oh, by the way, Louis, I hope all these clocks don't keep you awake. They're kind of noisy, but, well, I like them. Good night." He closed the door. Louis stood there with a puzzled frown on his face. There was something going on in this house that he couldn't quite get hold of. He thought of Jonathan standing paralyzed while the clock in the church steeple tolled. He thought of Mrs. Zimmerman listening at the wall. It was strange. "Oh, well," he thought, shrugging his shoulders, "people are funny sometimes." Louis climbed into bed and turned off the light. A few minutes later, he turned it back on. He realized that he was still tense, excited, and wide awake. He climbed out of bed and walked over to the shaky-looking bamboo bookcase that stood by the closet door. What a lot of old dusty books. He pulled one out and wiped the dust off of it with his sleeve. The faded gilt letters on the black buckram spine said, "John L. Stoddard's Lectures, Volume 9, Scotland, England, London." Louis opened the book and flipped through the slick, glossy pages. He held the book up to his nose. It smelled like Old Spice talcum powder. Books that smelled that way were usually fun to read. He threw the book onto his bed and went to his suitcase. After rummaging about for a while, he came up with a long, narrow box of chocolate-covered mints. He loved to eat candy while he read, and lots of his favorite books at home had brown smudges on the corners of the pages. A few minutes later, Louis was sitting up in bed with his pillows propped behind him. He was reading about how the Scotch nobles had murdered poor Rizzio right in front of Mary, Queen of Scots. Stoddard compared Rizzio to a purple velvet plum spurting plum juice in all directions. The nobles dragged the poor man, kicking and screaming, into the hallway, where they stabbed him some more. 56 times, said Stoddard, though he didn't say who counted the stabs. Louis flipped the page and bit into a peppermint patty. Now Stoddard was talking about the permanence of bloodstains and wondering whether or not the stain on the hall floor in Hollywood really was Rizzio's blood or not. Louis began to yawn. He turned off the light and went to sleep. But he was awakened quite suddenly a little while later. He had been dreaming that he was being chased by the Queen of Spades. Now he sat up, wide awake. He was scared, and he didn't know why. Creak, creak. Someone was tiptoeing down the hall. Louis sat still and listened. Now the sound was outside his door. Now it was going away down the hall. Creak, creak, creak. Louis slid out of bed. As slowly and carefully as he could, he tiptoed to the door. He opened it just as slowly and carefully. He didn't open it far, just a crack. He looked out. The hall was dark except for a glimmering gray window down at the far end. But Louis could hear someone moving, and now he saw the faint, pale circle of a flashlight moving over the wallpaper. Frightened, Louis pulled the door shut and then opened it just a crack. The flashlight beam had stopped. Now the figure with the flashlight brought his fist down on the wall, hard. Louis heard little clots of plaster falling down into the space between the walls. The figure pounded again and again. Louis stared and opened the door wider. Now the shadowy intruder stepped back, and Louis saw a bulky shadow against the hall window, a bulky, bearded shadow with a pipe in its mouth. Jonathan. And that is where I will leave you with The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs. We have a couple of hard copies here in the library, and you can also find it on audio on Hoopla. I hope you enjoyed this little excerpt. I really hope you will go and finish the book, one of my favorite books. And I hope we'll see you here again for another First Chapter Friday. Bye-bye.